Hi, everyone. John Michael Coppola here, and welcome to the Chicago Theater Makers Podcast, where we chat with the actors, directors, choreographers, designers, producers, music directors, lyricists, playwrights, and all the artists who make the Chicago area theaters come alive. We're so excited to have you here with us today. But before we get started, we just want to remind you to please like, subscribe to, and share this podcast with your friends and colleagues who you think would appreciate the conversations we're having. We'd be so grateful for your support in this way so we can continue to bring these stories for years to come. Thanks again for being here, and now, curtain up on today's episode. We are extremely honored today to introduce our very first guest of Season 2. For 2 decades, he has been the chief theater critic for the Chicago Tribune, and as such, is the influential voice for one of the most vibrant theater scenes in the world. He's seen it all, reviews about 200 shows a year in Chicago alone, and covers every major Broadway opening, establishing himself as one of the nation's most prolific and well-respected critics. A veteran of renowned entertainment news source Variety, he developed a specialty in covering those crucial pre-Broadway tryouts and has twice served on the Pulitzer Prize jury for drama. He has also beatboxed on stage with Lin-Manuel Miranda. Really? Look it up on YouTube. In 2001, he was named by American Theater magazine as one of the 12 most influential theater critics in America. He also quite literally wrote the book on Chicago's theatrical history. Bigger, Brighter, Louder, 100 Years of Chicago Theater was published in 2013, and his second publication, Rise Up, Broadway and American Society, From Angels in America to Hamilton, was published in 2015. In 2016, the New York Times cited Jones as an important reason that Broadway shows try out in Chicago, noting the role his reviews have played in helping producers improve their productions for the New York runs. As of 2021, he took on an added role as editorial page editor for the Tribune, now balancing his reviewing responsibilities with guiding the entire opinion section of this major metropolitan newspaper. And all of that just scratches the surface of his many contributions and accolades. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Chris Jones. Now let's go to the top of the show. Hi, Chris. Thanks so much for joining me here on the podcast. How are you?
Very well. How about yourself?
I'm well. Thank you so much for asking. So listen, we always start each podcast the same way, and that is to please tell our listeners a little bit about your background, a little bit about your training, but most importantly, what your very first theater experience was. And I hand it over to you.
So I'm Chris Jones. I've been the theater critic, the chief theater critic at the Chicago Tribune for over 20 years, well over 20 years. And that's what I've done for the last 2 decades of my life. I'm also now the critic for the New York Daily News. Yes. So I spend my time partly in New York and partly here in Chicago, mostly reviewing theater. Earlier on in my career, I worked for Variety in the 1990s, where I covered the Broadway road for them, really actually beginning in the late 80s, all the way through the 90s. I've also been a theater professor early in my career. I taught at both Northern Illinois and DePaul universities before I became a theater critic, and I've continued to teach in the graduate program at DePaul over the years as well. My job mostly involves going to the theater and writing reviews, as you know.
Yes.
But I've also been a reporter and an arts columnist, so I've written about cultural issues more generally. Although I think my specialty is Chicago theater, but I also have sort of written about news stories about the theater, write obituaries of major people within the theater, write about trends, write about the economics of the business, which is what I did at Variety for a long time when I wrote about the Broadway road. And I cover kind of the waterfront when it comes to live performance.
And you've written 2 books as well on the theater, which I just discovered the other day.
I have.
I'm going to go over to our local library and see if they exist over there. I hope to find them.
Yeah, I wrote one book on that was a history of reviews in Chicago at the Tribune, just focused on Tribune reviews, beginning in this newspaper where I'm in the office of right now. It goes back to 1847. The Tribune has been reviewing Chicago theater since the mid-19th century, since the 1850s. So I got interested one day in what the first theater review was in the Tribune,
Mhm.
which actually is a complicated question because you have to define what a theater review is in order
Yeah.
to answer that question. And then I decided to pick out some reviews from the paper's archives, 150 years worth, that were sort of emblematic of changes in the Chicago theater. So some of them deal with interesting critics and what they had to say, some of which was controversial. Some of it deals with sort of major events like A Raisin in the Sun being produced here prior to Broadway, say, or the first review of a play by David Mamet, or something like that. Sort of seminal events in Chicago theater that were very, very interesting to me. One of the first reviews was of a guy called an actor called Joseph Jefferson, who is kind of
Hmm.
famous among actors because um, we have the Jefferson Awards named after him.
Yes.
And it was sort of interesting about how what was striking about that particular review was that the critic at the time, by the way, the critics early on were unnamed at the Tribune, which was typical of movie critics too. They were all anonymous. The movie critic was actually called Matinee, which the theater critic was unnamed, or they sometimes went by initials. And they but it was interesting how that early review talked about the level of realism in Joseph Jefferson's acting. And I'd happened upon that review. It was a show called Rip Van Winkle that Jefferson famously did for a long time. And what was striking, as I said about the review, is that the critic was just impressed with the level of naturalistic acting, sort of Chicago style acting.
Mm.
And I remember thinking right from the beginning, Chicago actors were being praised as sort of incredibly intense and incredibly realistic. Now, whether we would think of Jefferson as realistic acting now, probably not. But
Yeah.
in the terms of the day, and this is 50 years before Ibsen, that was how it was viewed. So that was one book. And then the other book was more Broadway focused, and that was on how Broadway got to Hamilton. It was sort of a look at, it took Hamilton as the ending point and then looked at what were the trends and issues that helped create Hamilton.
It's funny, one of the questions I had set up here, and maybe I'll just jump to that one right now, is Chicago theater has gone by lots of different names like scrappy and, in your face.
Yeah.
How would you describe Chicago theater? And in your opinion, do you think maybe it's back to that Joseph Jefferson review that sort of gave it its famous technique, if you will, or the famous moniker? Or do you have another opinion about where it got its reputation?
Well, I often describe it as a stool with three legs, actually, which is, and I'll tell you what I think the three legs are. I would say number one leg is um, what I would call the second city leg in some ways, which is the Chicago theater beginning in the 1950s, which is when Chicago theater, as we now think of it, really got going.
Okay.
There was certainly theater here beginning in 1850. As I said, there were as many as 24 touring theaters in the Loop.
Hmm.
But they were mostly presenting shows from New York, touring casts. It wasn't, to quote my predecessor, Richard Christensen, it wasn't a theater of our own at that point. It was simply a major stop on the Broadway Road. And that's what the Tribune covered, because that's what the critics went to. There was that many touring shows. You were out there every night. But
Sure.
in the 1950s, we began to see work made in Chicago in greater quantity. And one of the major impulses was, I think, came out of the Compass Players and the University of Chicago, and the creation of improv
Uh-huh.
and sketch comedy that really revolutionized American comedy, to my mind anyway, and that resulted in the formation of Second City through various machinations. And then Second City, I think, had a big impact on what Chicago writers wrote about. I'm thinking particularly about Mamet, who, had a job at Second City, and Mamet's early plays were really sketch comedy type pieces of writing with clip dialogue and short scenes and that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
that was definitely, and I think throughout the years, Chicago has been obviously the font of improv and sketch, and that's where all these late night comedy hosts came out of, and of
Mhm.
course lots of great movie actors and TV actors. So that's definitely part of it. This ability, the yes and concept, is definitely part of Chicago theater, and it is more influential than some people realize. And then the second one I would say is really associated with Steppenwolf theater more than anywhere, but kind of fits everybody in Chicago. It's this idea of in your face acting, and if you say in your face in the UK, you generally mean a particular style of writing in the early years of the 21st century. Walt Ravenhill, people like that. But in Chicago, in your face tends to mean acting. And what is in your face acting? Well, it's in the eye of the beholder a bit, I think. But I would say that Chicago actors, the reputation of Chicago actors in New York and elsewhere is that they're more real. They may be less pretty, but they're more authentic. They don't mess around. They do it for the work and not for the money. Um, they are ensemble based, which means that they're generous to other actors on the stage. And that ethos, which I think really is synonymous with the early years of Steppenwolf, is an important part of what Chicago theater means. And by that I mean, many is the time in my career where I've gone to a play and I've seen a cast of 24 actors, 23 from Chicago. Maybe the lead is not from Chicago and the lead is in a different play because there's an aesthetic here that we all recognize when we see it. It's not unified entirely, but it is a thing we can I feel like I can tell a Chicago actor most of the time. And that has been a really important that's a really important part here, that we have particularly good actors. I tell this story sometimes about being at Tracy Letts's August Osage County on Broadway, and the guy next to me in the seat literally leaning back like this going, "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God," as if he was being blown back by the force of the Amy Morton or somebody.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, and that's what Chicago actors stand for to this day. So I think that's a second leg of the stool. Then the third leg of the stool, I would say, is for that you would look over at Northwestern really, and you would sort of see this interest in adapting work from non-theatrical sources. So we developed, again, sometimes at Steppenwolf, sometimes at the Goodman, sometimes at Looking Glass, those three theaters particularly, but those theaters got very into not doing plays or musicals that existed, but actually adapting something like, say, an E.L. Doctorow book or the Notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci or something like that.
Yeah.
And they created that sort of aesthetic here that you didn't find in New York. I remember one of my critic friends from New York coming to Chicago once and going to me somewhat snottily, as they do, like, "How come you guys don't just do more plays? Why do you do all these things that are not plays?" And I was like, "Well, I guess that's what we do here." And a lot of that, it comes out of, Robert Breen, it comes out of Frank Galati's work at Northwestern, comes out of Mary Zimmerman's work at Northwestern. And that had a certain visual panache to it as well. And so that's a part of what we do, I think, that those adaptations are quite common here. It was interesting. Just before I started this podcast, I wrote a review of a Tom Hanks project in New York, um, The World of Tomorrow, I think, or something like that. And the co-writer of that was of that tradition. And in the program, he's talking about how when he was working with Frank Galati, how he became interested in how to adapt short stories. So that's a special thing that we do here too. So I would say you put those three things together: the role of improv and sketch and how it affected how plays were written, the role of powerful acting and how that affected how people see American acting, and then thirdly, this role of adaptation and how a lot of the original work here was created not from actual scripts that existed, but from sources that some artist here thought could be turned into a show.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. That's such a beautiful perspective and very, very visual to encapsulate as well. So how did you come here to Chicago? What brought you to Chicago from London?
So, well, I originally came to the U.S. when I was 20. I graduated early. I went to grad school. I did a PhD at Ohio State. which I got when I was only 26. And then I started working. Working for Variety at that time, and then I got a teaching gig at NIU in DeKalb, and I taught there in the 1990s. And then around 1992, I moved to Chicago, so that's into the city. So that's now been, like I said, 30 odd years. So originally to teach at Northern, and to work for Variety in Chicago, because I thought I could cover the whole country from here. So that's what I did.
Now, what's it like covering both New York and Chicago? Are there any challenges with covering both?
Well, aside from when the planes are screwed up, that's a challenge. And I cover mostly Broadway in New York, so I don't see
Yeah.
the same range of theater I do here, though I do go to some off-Broadway stuff.
Yeah.
It's just a lot. That's the challenge. A good show is a good show. I think it helps me to know what's going on in New York, from a perspective of judging Chicago theater. Often I've already seen a show and it premieres here, and that helps me have a bit of an insight in what it could be. Often it's better.
Sure.
Sometimes it's not, but I have a sense of what it could be, I think. I like it. I think they're both very interesting. Like, obviously, if you're interested in musicals as I am, New York is kind of the place for that, I think. Chicago, though, really holds its own, especially when it comes to plays. And we develop lots of new work here. So sometimes I'll see a show in Chicago and then I'll go and see it again in New York, such as Purpose, for example, or Little Bear Ridge Road just a couple of weeks ago, which, moved. And then sometimes you get this insight into, sometimes people ask me, do shows get better or worse when they go to New York? And the answer is it depends. I've seen both. I've seen shows that fall apart more often than you think. And sometimes shows just don't land there. The one that comes to mind there is Tommy, which was a huge hit here. And on the night I saw it at the Goodman here, it felt like this was a monster hit. And then I went to see it on Broadway, and I'm sitting there really 15 minutes in, and I thought, okay, this is not good. This is going down. This is not going to work. And it didn't. And why? Well, the audience was different. The space was different. The performances were even a little different.
Yeah.
Theater, as you know, it changes night to night. It's alive. It's very difficult to predict.
Yeah.
It can shift around. And all that a critic can do really is offer an insight into what happened on one particular night. And that's really all you can do.
That brings us to another question I had further down the pike, so I'll pull it up now. Reviews can, of course, not break a production, but they can surely contribute to its success. So how does knowing that influence your work?
Well, I think the key to being a critic is trust. So you have to you number one have to have trust of your readers. So the problem comes when you say something's great and the reader shows up and it's not, and then they're like, well, the next time they read a really positive review by me, they're not going to necessarily go out and buy a ticket. So I try and guard against that. I try and not lie. I don't sugarcoat things. I mean, that's not to say that I don't consciously avoid being cruel or unpleasant. I've never really liked doing that. And I think in Chicago, that's particularly egregious, where it's very personal. The theater business here, it's a small world.
Yeah.
We don't need to be making fun of people or delighting in someone's failures. It's a little different when you've got a $20 million production or something. You can you feel a little freer to be that way. But certainly some young person in a storefront, I'm not going to, mock in some way.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I try to say exactly how I feel it went. And I try not to worry about what that will do to the box office. I do believe that when a critic likes something, which happens quite a lot, when you really like something, which happens occasionally, but does happen, it is sort of incumbent on you to shout it from the rooftops a bit, which I do. I try to do that. If something's really good, I try to do everything I can to get it attention in all the various avenues that I have. And I don't apologize for that. Some people think, though, you shouldn't do that. You should just write the review and then go away. I try not to do that because I think that otherwise there's not a lot of point in the job. You really should be able to, when you really believe in something, you should be able to get behind it and promote it, um, and tell people why. And you have to tell people several times to get them off their asses into the theater in many cases.
Yeah.
And so I've always tried to do that. And then if something's not good, you just sort of shut up about it. I mean, that's what you do, really.
Yeah.
Um, but that's sort of the way I've always operated as a critic here.
Well, the praise, when warranted, is no doubt appreciated by the theaters here in town and across the country. I mean, in New York and Chicago, but anybody who's going to give praise to a theater's struggling. I mean, since the pandemic, it's just not been the same. So, thank you for adding a positive voice when warranted and shouting it from the rooftops, as you said, as often as you can.
Right.
Yeah. Now, are there a few next few questions we might get a little bit more of the weeds. I want to get your opinion about a couple of topics. Are there any theater trends that you like or dislike at the moment, or have liked or disliked in the past that you wish to never see again or hope to that comes back?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think if we're talking about Chicago specifically, the thing I don't like more than anything is the relative lack of theater compared to before the pandemic. So I think if you would look at, I have a list in my head of shows that Chris Jones would normally have gone to, which is sort of an esoteric list. It's based on what I think people want to read about and also what I hope will be good, and shows that companies that I've historically covered, say, just the waterfront as I see it. And so it's not all equity theater even. It's just the shows that, I'm sort of interested in. And it's a big list because I have very Catholic tastes, and I try and see as many shows I try to go almost every night, which I have all my life. But the number of those shows has gone down. How much is open to debate, but I reckon it's about a third of the shows that I would have seen have gone away. And that's a combination of companies that aren't here anymore, or actually more likely companies that are producing less. So you have several companies now that are producing, used to do 5 shows a year, are now doing 2, some cases 1, some cases they go quiet for a while. And that is that's obviously not a good trend. That's got better the last year. Within the last 12 months, that's definitely got better. Some companies have come back. Some, so that's...
And some in grand style, building new facilities.
Yes, and some are building new theaters. Now we're also losing theaters at the same time.
Sadly.
As well. But I would say that we're just a smaller sector than we were. There was a period of time that I would think of as peak Chicago theater, and I usually tag that as the late aughts, sort of 2007, 8, 9, 10, when everything was booming here, and there were big people like Tracy Letts and Carrie Coon were just kind of on fire, and that was a period of, and also the improv scene here and the sketch comedy scene over at Second City, where you had Tina Fey over there, and you had Rachel Dratch and Keegan Michael Key and people like that. So, are we still there? No, we're not. We're absolutely not. And that, there's a lot more work to be done with that. And many things have gotten harder in Chicago theater. I think, the relative decline of media organizations, including mine, fewer readers, that's been a big problem. Particularly the decline in print media, because theater reviews tend to work better in print media because you don't have to, you just come across them. If you're a sports fan, you might just read my review of the show and then you might just go, which doesn't happen as easily online.
Yeah.
And I think that's a problem. I think there were people in the pandemic who left the profession here and never came back, or or chose to work else in another city, which has always happened, and that's no problem. But there was just a lot of it in the pandemic, I think. And then I think there's just sort of some issues that were endemic to Chicago that affected the theater, like the declines downtown and the perceptions of public safety and that kind of thing. Those all had an impact too. And I think just the funding issues also had an impact. But I think in general, the trajectory now is back up. So I feel good about that. I think it's crucial to retain artists here and to, there was a whole generation of actors that I admired when I first started who are now retired or in some cases no longer alive, frankly. And, I now see this other generation behind them that is kind of the actors now who really are the leading lights in our theater, and they have to be encouraged. They should be able to make a living and have a family if they wish and
Yeah.
live here, in the way that some others before them did. So I see all of that. I think that's very interesting. Obviously a lot of shows now are shorter than they were. I think that's a trend. That's a real trend. People don't like to turn their phones off for 3 hours. So it becomes harder to sell a show for 3 hours. I think, we see a lot of what I would call morally earnest plays where the point of view of the playwright is number one, the thing that's out front, not necessarily. August Wilson used to always say that he just wrote his characters and let them talk, and it wasn't him, it was his characters. And I think, we see that less. Frankly, we now see a lot of writers who are writing because they want to share a perspective, which is a perfectly valid reason to write a play. But it's a little different from what we saw before. And so I think all of those things are things that have sort of changed. Um, and then in New York, there's an economic crisis going on. It's very difficult to make money now in a musical.
Yes.
Because the cost structure is $25 million or $30 million even, and very hard to make that back unless you can run your show forever, which you probably can't. So all of those things, I think, are contributing to a difficult environment. One of the things that's happened here that's not a good trend at all is we had for many years here, many out of town tryouts. So it kind of what helped me make my career a bit, really. Where these shows would come here and I get to weigh in on them before New York. It was kind of great fun to do that. And
Mhm.
audiences here love doing that. Um, that has really dried up. There aren't any that I know of next year yet, and there will really been relatively few this year.
Yeah.
And so that creation of new work in Chicago is something that has to get reignited. And the Loop in general, the downtown theater district, also has to get reignited because I think that's been in somewhat of a tailspin over the last 5 years. Um, and then the other problem here that we always have is what I would call the mid-sized theater problem, which is where companies that grow beyond young people not making much money who are in their 20s doing shows and enjoying it into people, let's say in their 30s, who want to be able to have a salary and a life and an equity contract and all those reasonable things.
Yeah.
But that's difficult for them to make money. And those companies that want to support them always have a difficult time. But there's some good stuff going on there too. If you look at, say, Timeline Theater, which is one of those companies opening, as you said, a new theater, which is very exciting. Northlight Theater, which is an older theater, but still not a huge operation. That's opening a new theater up in Evanston where they
Yeah.
really belong, I think. So I think there's some good trends. Steep Theater, one of my favorite companies, they're opening a new theater as well in Edgewater. So there's definitely good stuff going on in on the landscape, so to speak.
Very encouraging to know. I forgot about Steep as well. Thanks for the reminder of that. Now, this next question has a bit of a buildup, and I am going to read it verbatim the way I wrote it because I don't want it to get out of context. So I appreciate your indulgence here. Now, for many years, and for good reason, there's been a long-held belief that particular roles in the theater should be portrayed by actors who are of the same ethnicity, culture, or lived experience being portrayed in a particular production. One of the more obvious examples was Jonathan Pryce portraying the engineer in Miss Saigon. Actors Equity had their opinion. Cameron McIntosh had his opinion, and those opposite opinions are still highly debated today for good reason, and it's the top of mind of many artists today as well. However, I recently had a conversation with a colleague about the possibility of a particular theater company producing the musical Ragtime, and the opinion came up that the artistic director of this particular theater should not be the one to direct it because they were a white male, not Jewish, and obviously not African American. And I was struck by this notion because one could argue then that you can't direct Oklahoma unless you're a cowboy or a farmer, or direct Little Shop if you're not a dentist or a florist. I exaggerate those last two examples, of course, but I'm just curious, do you think there's validity to that notion that those at the helm of a production should share an ethnic, racial, or lived experience that is reflected in the world of the play?
Well, I think one of my answers to questions like that is always everything in the theater is on a case by case basis, and
Fair, fair.
which is kind of how I look at it. It depends would be my answer to that. Um, I I generally try not to prejudge things. I don't inherently think that any particular director should direct any particular thing. There are and it really all depends on the show. I mean, I'll give you an example of one where I supported, where I would say, this is a New York example, but if you look at maybe Happy Ending, the musical, which some of your viewers I'm sure will know, that Darren Criss left that production for a while and they brought in somebody who was not Korean to play that role, who was not Asian even to play that role, and that caused a whole debacle. In that instance, I think that. Are you still hearing me? Okay, I think I'm frozen up, or you're frozen. Oh, I'm back.
That's okay. You're back. You're back. I'll edit that out. Yep.
Okay. Well, I'll start that again. So, in the case of maybe Happy Ending in New York, I think in that instance, I understood why people were upset, but I also thought that in the end, the person who should be determining who plays the role is really the person that created the musical, or in this case, the two people that created the musical. And if they didn't,
and they had a lot to say about that,
and they had a lot to say about it, and they very specifically, they very specifically said this could be played by anybody. Now, the cynic would say there's an economic reason for that, but that's okay too. And that was a sort of a ridiculous controversy in my mind. That that if the creatives wanted it that way, then the creative should have it that way. And I think that's fair enough. And obviously you can continue this argument way down so far that you can get to the point like, should you do you have to be gay to direct Angels in America, for example? I would say no, you don't. On the other hand, does a gay director bring a particular insight to Angels in America? I would say yes. Typically, they would. So, both things can be true at once, and I think that you just have to trust the people who are putting a show together to know what it is that they want. And I try not to have hard and fast rules that would get in the way of me. Enjoying it. I think too, in that issue, the other thing is that there's two separate arguments. There's the argument that gets made about opportunity for creative artists, which is the argument made in Happy Ending, very legitimate, that there are limited opportunities for actors of certain demographic kinds, and that those opportunities shouldn't be removed from them. I get that, but an audience generally is not preoccupied with employment opportunities. They're interested in the aesthetic or the political aspects of what they're seeing. So sometimes these arguments get all mixed up, and I think that's an argument too. So I think it depends is my answer, honestly.
Thank you so much for weighing in on that. I was hesitant to ask that question, but I'm
Sure,
very glad that I did. Appreciate it. Now, more and more productions, especially on Broadway, are finding the release of audience-generated clips is helping sell tickets and to keep the production alive. Do you feel that that's silencing the voice of the critic nowadays?
Well, I think if I'm being honest, it's definitely diminishing it. There's no question that social media is really becoming a much bigger deal. And also the ability, the idea of people creating content, audience members creating content around shows. I mean, if you were to ask me actually, what is the biggest trend I see on Broadway in Broadway design? The answer is the title of the show as part of the set. So I went to every show now in New York has the title of the show looking at you when you walk in. So Queen of Versailles, Chess, I'm trying to think about, and not Oedipus, I don't think, because they're British.
Death Becomes Her? Is Death Becomes Her another one?
Yeah. I mean, so typically there'll be the logo of the show. Now, is that a design component? No, it's a marketing component, and
Yeah,
so that's what people do now. They know that, so that what happens is you walk in the theater, you get the program out, you have the logo on the stage,
yeah,
you social media it. So does that mean that dinosaurs like me have no power? Well, I wouldn't say no power, but we have
yeah.
less power. Now, some people would say that's great. Generally speaking, people in the theater, if you ask them about critics, they will almost always say the same thing, which is usually, I want there to be a wide variety of opinions. That's what artists want. And if I were in that role, I would say exactly that. It's not my interest. My interest and my employer's interest, obviously, is that I is for people to listen to me. I mean, that is kind of what you get paid for. So
Exactly.
you have to fight to be listened to above everyone else, and you have to try and distinguish yourself from all the people you've just identified who are now in the, let's say, critical space. And you have to try and say, well, I can be trusted more, or I've been at this long, or I know more, or whatever else you can come up with. We all try it in different ways.
Yeah.
But you are seeing an amateurization in all kinds of areas of the performing arts, from acting to writing criticism. You have to sort of make the case for why people should pay, because you do have to pay to read me, why they should do that, and that's just the way it is. But I don't think we're dead entirely, but I think we're diminished. I would completely accept that.
As the punchline goes, everyone's a critic. But
Yeah.
everywhere but here, this podcast, we don't critique, we just interview critics and hopefully others of your legacy as well. Now, you mentioned a bunch of early performances, TFA, Rachel's Ratch. Are there any early performances of Chicago artists who become stars, either in TV or film or on stage, that are most memorable?
Well, I saw many, many of those people in early work. There's no question about that. I think somebody like Carrie Coon, who's now a pretty big star, did
Yeah,
some
she's wonderful.
like the people that I feel like I could see the talent in. I would certainly say Carrie Coon, who I would see in small Victory Gardens or somewhere, I think it was, and she was just explosively good. I think I saw it in Michael Shannon, who was, I first reviewed him when he was like 17, and
Wow.
I wouldn't say I thought he was conventionally brilliant, but you knew that there was no other actor like him. So I think his performances in at Red Orchid and elsewhere were really incredible. And then the other person in the realm of musical theater was Jessie Mueller,
Hmm.
who would be doing small, she'd be in Meet Me in St. Louis and at Drury Lane or somewhere, or at Marriott, and I really felt like she was just an extraordinary talent. I did my best to promote her career as well, because I really believed in her. So that's three right there who I thought were all huge talents. I think Keegan Michael Key at Second City was very clearly going places. Jack McBrayer at Second City too. He was incredible in those early shows. He was hilariously funny. Um, and so definitely some of those actors that I really memorably remember doing incredible work here.
Now, we touched on the influencer influence in theater in general and the promotion thereof. How does one become a theater critic in the regular
In a
academic
way, well,
sense? The
one
way
gets the job, really.
exactly right, right,
It's
right.
one of these gigs where the getting the job is the hardest thing, and once you got the job, you're okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I run a critics training program. I have for a long time, and
Oh, do you?
yeah, I do, at the Eugene O'Neill Center in Connecticut. And
Oh,
I've
fantastic.
trained people who are now working at the Washington Post and at the New York Times and all kinds of places. So, there are editors at big newspapers who watch out for writers who are very interesting to them. And there was definitely a sense during the pandemic era, that there was too many people like me in this job, and we needed to find more young writers, your diverse young writers of color.
Mhm.
And we set about at this institute and helping those people get jobs. And I think we're pretty successful in it. Now it declined, it sort of came simultaneously with the profession getting a bit harder to be sustained in. So there was that. But I think in general, we were able to do that very effectively. And there's now a lot of very good young critics who are other than white guys in these jobs and they're actually the dominant group now. I would say there's not that many people like me left. So I feel very positive about that. I think the profession's in very good hands going forward. I mean, the advice to people who want to be a critic is that you've got to just write yourself, and you've got to get noticed doing that. I always believe that part of being a critic is being a reporter, that a lot of the job is to say, this is what happened on this night. This and I know the critics that I like the most are very good at reporting. I also think that ultimately, as a critic, you're writing a piece of art no different from a play. You've got to write, it's got to be fun to read. And the reality of the theater, if you think about it in Chicago, I write about things that I wrote about a play Blackbird 2 weeks ago.
Mm-hmm. We had them on the show here, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which the capacity of that theater was, 30 people or something, right?
Yeah.
So no one is going to have, very few people are going to have seen the show before they read my review or even will see the show. Such a small number of people. So the only way anybody's going to be interested in that review is that it's worth reading, regardless of your view on the show, whether or not you're going to go and see it. That's different from how people consume criticism for, say, a restaurant, where they typically are looking at a restaurant critic's review because they want to know where should I eat tonight, or even a movie where they're looking at, what film they should see. So sometimes in theater, because it has such a small capacity, sometimes you have to try and write about things that are interesting to people never going to the show, not going to the show. And that is quite challenging because you have to talk about the issues that the play brings up. And I always think that as I've gotten older, I've become more interested in what does a show mean, or what does a show tell us, than what does it, is it any good? So, I mean, for example, I was at Chess on Broadway last week, and I was like, that to me was an emblem of how Broadway has returned to its old ways. I was like, okay, they promised to change. They're not really changed. They're still doing the same thing. It was like something out of the 80s back in it,
Yeah.
And whatever you thought about that, whether that was good or bad, it still was striking to me.
Mm-hmm.
Or you might say that, there's a lot of shows that are, a friend of mine calls them what's the phrase? Theraturgy, which is sort of therapy-based plays that are really about a central character working through some kind of emotional trauma, which is very much a trend at the moment. There's lots of those plays around. And so I think that you have to write about what does a play say about the moment, or what does it mean, or what does it tell you?
Yeah.
I mean, just to give you a review I wrote this morning of a play in New York by Tom Hanks, it was about set at the World's Fair in 1939, and I started thinking about how, technology in 1939 was introduced better, that people went to the World's Fair and they weren't, they became more comfortable with television, say, and the tech bros of today really should have a World's Fair, so they're not shoving AI down our throats, So so the plays and musicals and plays reflect societal trends all the time, and I think that's very interesting. You can discern trends in the theater over long periods of time, particularly musicals, because musicals are very incremental. So, um, if if you look at, say, Hamilton, and you look at the shows that followed Hamilton, like Suffs, for example, or if you look at, I just reviewed Hell's Kitchen in Chicago, and Hell's Kitchen could never have been written without In the Heights. It's very similar to In the Heights. I don't mean that necessarily critically. I just mean it's the same. He obviously saw that show and sort of imbued that structure. And that's what people do musicals do. They build on the shows that have gone before, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yep.
But you have to look for these broader trends, I think.
First of all, I want to thank you for the insight about all of that, because it was a pretty broad question. We only have a few more minutes, so I would love to ask, wrapping up, what do you hope to see for the future of Chicago theater?
Well, I'm really happy to answer that because I think about that a lot. I'd like to see kindness in terms of the way people operate. I found the social media environment that sort of took over Chicago theater for a while to be toxic and not helpful, frankly. And so I think that's gotten much better. But there was definitely a time when people were kind of ripping each other apart and going after critics and all the rest of it. And I don't care for that. And I think that um, there were rifts here that never needed to happen. And so I'd like to see, I'd like to see that never come back. I'd like to see more shows, as Tony Kushner would say, more life. And I'd like to see. Right now, we don't have enough things to see, I think, and I'd like to see that happen. I'd like to see false conflicts go away. Like people think that if a company is successful, that they get jealous of that. I see sometimes. I don't care for that. I think a vibrant downtown with lots of shows from New York is actually a help to Chicago theater. It's not a hindrance. They're not in competition at all. Theaters rarely compete with theaters. They actually compete with other things. So I'd like to see that. I'd like to see more spaces. I think one of the big problems in Chicago theater is the loss of what I would call the small commercial theater industry. So back in the day here, you had commercial producers such as you or I who would say, I want to produce this show, this little musical here. I'm going to take it to the Royal George and we can run for a year. And that's what they did. Many shows did. And that hugely important to have long runs because they provide jobs for actors, frankly, and they make life here as an artist more sustainable. And we've lost that industry, and that's really been, or at least we've lost the viability of that industry, and that has been a real big problem that we have to correct. We have to have more for-profit theater here because that's really, if New York is driven by that. We don't need to be driven by it. We're driven rightly by our nonprofits, which are what we do here, and there's nothing wrong with that. But we need the other sector because frequently those are the big employers. And so, I'd like to see that too. And then I'd like to see more artists that are very interesting choose to work here. I think it's very exciting when sort of nationally interesting or internationally interesting directors work here, and work with Chicago artists and performers, and that's very important too. It's very important for Chicago to maintain its reputation globally as a major theater city. We shouldn't assume that's forever. You shouldn't assume that will always be the case, and we can often think it is, and it's not. Reputations come and go, communities ebb and flow. We have to market ourselves sufficiently as a city and as an artistic community here that people come here to see theater. That's a big thing. People do, but not on the level that I'd like to see.
Well, I have to agree with you. I hope that there is much more Chicago theater to come, if for no other reason, to continue to have your voice here in town. And it's encouraging to know that you are educating others to bring their voices into the theater landscape. So I want to thank you again for joining us on the podcast. It was a huge honor to have you here.
My pleasure.
Thanks for joining us at the Chicago Theater Makers Podcast. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The Chicago Theater Makers Podcast is a production of Spirit Art LLC, and our podcast theme music is by Paul Langford. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the podcast, please drop us a note at our website, ChiTheaterMakersPodcast.com. That's ChiTheater, makers with an S, podcast.com. We hope you enjoyed spending time with us as much as we enjoyed spending it with you, and we'll see you on the board soon.